my dears, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. Surprised to get a second video today. Ride the Cyclone was one of my very first disability dramaturgy deep dives from before I knew what a dramaturg was, and I really don't want to redo the entire project because I agree with most of my original analysis and I don't have enough to add to warrant me doing another full academic deep dive, nor do I have the time and energy, frankly, particularly because I'm rather sick right now, if you can't tell by how I sound, and I decided to do this like maybe 3 days ago. But I have returned to Cyclone recently to be involved in the Wait in the Wings incredible documentary on the show, and there were enough things in the original video that I wanted to edit differently or phrase differently or just add an extra level of nuance or legal security on that I thought it might be wise to touch up the old video, add some extra commentary within it from a different academic lens, since I anticipate more people are going to want to learn about this stuff after seeing that documentary, which I will link at the top of the description and also in the card above. Brendan covered the history and legacy of the show way better than I ever could. My job is primarily the disability thing, so you should definitely go check it out. For friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a green t-shirt with a brown and cream flannel plaid on top, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. And in the original video from like 2 years ago, I am similar hair. What am I wearing? I like how I wrote that and then I didn't write down what I'm wearing. I am wearing a white button-up shirt with a gray vest, neither of which fit me anymore, but that's kind of a costume in relation to the show. I don't feel well. This is what we're going with today. It's fine. And I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf in that one. Also, if you're new here, hi, hello. I'm so glad to have you. My name is Sydney, but pronouns are they, them. I'm an actor, dramaturg, and educator with specific research focus on accessible education, minority need analysis, and accessible theater. I made the original video about 2-ish years ago as a part of my undergrad thesis on accessible arts education, which involves staging the first all-nerdy cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And now I work in the theater industry as a grown-up, and I have a series on this channel where I break down shows that explicitly and or implicitly involve disability to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be, work on those critical thinking media analysis skills, and talk about ways to more ethically stage and talk about these shows, always with a cool, that happened, now what mindset that lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. And I don't think that my cool, that happened, now what energy made it into that original video very much, which is part of why we're here to redo it a bit. To be super clear, there's nothing wrong with being angry at how things currently stand. Believe me, I am often, but I also think that these things are changing quite rapidly, and while it's not always our job to teach people or make people feel comfortable with our feelings on something that affects them a teeny tiny bit and affects us a lot of people just don't know things and want to know things and don't quite know where to start, and I don't think that I left much room for that energy originally because I made this original analysis via the lens of dealing with my own ableism in theater situation with my thesis, and also some semblance of nobody around me was believing that that was happening, and so I sort of put Easter eggs into that video to try to have proof in case something ended up happening with the show, which it did, and then we made a documentary about it that I will link below if you want to see the whole story of creating Curious Incident. But upon reflection, that made the original analysis of this feel a little bit skewed and maybe not entirely fair in regards to looking at the show in particular, so I want to give it a second crack at it. But first, I'm gonna let little Sydney take it away for a little bit, and then I'll be back. Okay, so Ride the Cyclone. RTC is the second musical in a trilogy thing, about the fictional Uranium City. It's about a group of 6 teenagers who are members of the St. Cassian High School Chamber Choir of Uranium City, Saskatchewan, in Canada, who die in a roller coaster accident, and they have to pitch their case of why they should be brought back to life to a fortune-telling machine named Karnak, who spends the entire show also waiting to die because a rat named Virgil is slowly chomping through his cables. Obviously, this is a dark comedy. It gives off strong, let's put 7 weird people in a room and see what play comes out of it vibe, which is a premise that I personally really enjoy. The characters all have their songs about either why they should win or just like songs about who they are, and they all grow to realize how beautiful life is and appreciate each other and whatnot, but in a weird, wacky, and comical way. Oh, huge spoilers, by the way. We're gonna majorly spoil the show in here. Forgot to say that. I think I can get away without telling you who wins. You can Google it if you're bored. So our characters are Karnak, the fortune teller, Virgil, the rat, who's about to kill the fortune teller and also himself because the shock's gonna electrocute him. Ocean O'Connell Rosenberg, she's sort of kind of the main character, I guess. Super autistic coded, the perfect overachiever, thinks she's most likely to succeed, and comes off very harsh and self-centered a lot of the time. Noel Gruber, who's the only gay guy in town and dreams of living a real-life film noir. Misha Baczynski, how do I describe this person? He's Ukrainian and his mother was dying from radiation poisoning, so she put him up for US adoption and lied that he was 2 years old, so when he showed up a drunk teenager, his new family kind of hated and avoided him. And he's also an influencer, but not in a cringy way somehow, and he has a fiance back in Ukraine who he's madly in love with. There are theories that she's a catfish. I also thought that for a while. I still kind of believe that, even after hearing some actors disagree and say like, well, she's his motivation, so she has to be real, because then what does he have to live for? If she is a catfish, she for sure is not Noel, as some of the theories suggest. I think that's absurd, but just throwing theories out there. Constance Blackwood is the goody two-shoes of the group. She's super, super, super nice, but also secretly kind of hates herself, and she just needs a hug. This poor child needs a hug. And then Jane Doe is the odd one out. She was found after the accident without a head, and nobody came to claim her. She was named Jane Doe by the coroner, and she does not know who she is, and she's sad about it, and everybody tries to support her, and it's kind of sweet. And then we have the reason we're here, Ricky Potts, a boy who's born with an unnamed degenerative disease that left him mute and unable to walk. He uses crutches, and he copes by existing in his own internal, complex world of fantasies. His song is called Space Age Bachelor Man, and it's wonderful. We're gonna get back to that in a bit. Anyway, at the end of the show, the person who gets sent back gets sent back. They sing a song about how the world is nice, and the rest of them go into what comes next together. The show was created by Brooke Maxwell and Jacob Richmond, and it had its first production back in 2008 in Victoria, Canada, where it was less of a show with a strong plot and more like a cabaret of each kid telling their story. I also believe that there were more writers at that point. I feel like I heard that. I feel like I read that somewhere. It gained traction from there. It did another edition in 2011 in Toronto. In 2013, they toured Western Canada. And then in 2015, they were picked up to make their US debut at the Chicago Shakespeare Theatre. I think this is when the competition aspect was added to the show to make things more cohesive and have like a purpose for it. I'm not quite sure. If it wasn't particularly for that production, it was there by that production. Then they did an off-Broadway run in New York in 2016, followed by a 2018 production in Seattle, a 2019 one in Atlanta and Minneapolis, and then in 2022 it did shows in Ontario, North Carolina, and at the McCarter Theatre in New Jersey and the Blue Bridge Theatre in Victoria, Canada. The show is currently, I wrote this a month ago, the show is no longer open at the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. It just closed a few weeks ago. Also, the cast album came out in 2021. What I can't figure out for the life of me is when the show started licensing, because typically, other than creating like a high school edition for a script, which shows sometimes do, once shows are picked up to be licensed by theaters around the country, the script is frozen, meaning that they no longer will make changes to it, which is very odd because in all of these mainstream theaters, the show has been making small changes between each run, and it's also being done by high schools and colleges, and so I'm not sure if they keep updating the licensed script as well. Though I know that a big change made recently was updating the licensed script. I don't know about the other thing. Anyway, that's a semantics thing. Probably holds no meaning to you right now. We're gonna get there later. Let's talk about the actual show. Me again. So small changes can actually happen when something is licensed. You just have to reach out to the rights holder to ask for it. For example, if you wanted to take out a swear word in a script for your high school version, or if a line ends up having racial connotations because of a casting choice in a way that's not super great, and those changes won't find their way into the licensed script, but they will be allowed for your specific licensed performances if you ask and they approve of that change. I do think the Cyclone situation is still a bit strange in that the show is still seemingly actively being worked on, and it seems like they're changing aspects of it between runs for some of the licensed versions, but not others. But I could be wrong on that. As I said before, I've heard legends about the show for a while. It's like TikTok famous, which TikTok is not my thing. Finally seeing it, I was a bit underwhelmed. And I know that over film, the magic of the show is not going to transfer as well as it would in the space, so it's not fair to completely judge based on that. I acknowledge this. But I didn't feel particularly in love with it as much as everyone told me I would be. I will say the McCarter production grabbed me way more than the off-Broadway version did. It is definitely growing on me, and I don't know if that's because it's genuinely very great and amazing, or if it's because I spent like 5 days in-depth researching the show nonstop and I've forced myself to like it to justify the amount of time I spent on it. But maybe I'll be obsessed in a few weeks. Who knows? My brain is a weird place. The concept is really cool, and the way that each character expresses themselves through a completely different genre of music than the last is really cool. And particularly with the 2022 production, the amount of love on that stage is electric and truly carries throughout the whole piece. I also understand why this is something that really caught on with younger people during the pandemic, particularly on TikTok, because it is messages of everybody feeling isolated and alone, but also celebrating that individuality and everybody coming unlikely friends at the end of the day. Also, dark comedy has easy cosplays to do, music in every genre that people will like, and right now, slightly wacky shows about facing mortality and appreciating life with young people at the helm have been doing really well, given the headspace that we all got into during the last couple years. Playbill recently ran a really great article about this titled Why Gen Z Loves Ride the Cyclone. I will link in the description below. It's basically the same points that I already wrote like 3 weeks prior, so that made me feel really good about my research. As a media analyst, all of this makes sense to me. It's not majorly my cup of tea as a show. Again, that may change. It is starting to change. But either way, I appreciate it nonetheless. And obviously, I'm always ready to support new works because we don't have enough of them. And since I write new works, I understand how terribly, overwhelmingly difficult it is in this current theater climate, and I want to appreciate it for that. However, I will still criticize the show and how it handles disability, because supporting new works does not mean pretending that it is perfect and fine, and I'm kind of tired of people refusing to criticize art because they want to love and support it. You love and support things by helping them grow and get better. That's how Yeah, so with that, let's talk about the character of Ricky Potts. His general plotline is that he has a degenerative disease, so he does not speak and he uses crutches, and he copes by hiding in his truly wild inner world that he's created. And in death, he becomes able-bodied, and this is how we learn all of this about him. And in the off-Broadway production, he had a line where he was like, I've always been this way. It's just that nobody listened to me until now. And he also conceded, that's not just in the off-Broadway, that's in the McCarter too. That line is still there. And in that old production, he also conceded his chance of being resurrected because he thought it would be a dick move to vote for himself, which, fine. But having the only character to do that be the disabled one is definitely a choice. That was removed from the later script in like later productions, but whether he concedes or not, they didn't really change it, so either way he just never argues as to why he should get saved before he has this realization. Like, the whole show, it just feels like he's kind of just there, and if somebody was completely unfamiliar with the show and saw a production where Ricky just was erased from the script, I honestly don't think that you would come away with any different experience or emotion or thought. He feels a little tacked on at the end of like, oh, we're making a thing about death, let's include disability to spice it up a bit, but not actually think it through kind of thing, which people keep doing in the theater, and I'm like, stop it. I will say I really like how in his song he is a sexual being, and you realize that he's not the super sweet innocent kid you always think he is, like we always assume disabled people to be. He's also super weird and super sexual, and that's super rad. In regards to the disability being cured in death situation, I got two thoughts here. The first, most obvious one is no. No. And rather than re-explain, I'm just going to quote from my disability media tropes video. We also have the killing off your disabled character, and it's very similar to how in the bury your gays thing, that prevents people from having to think about the fact that like one day maybe this gay would get older and find another gay and they would be gay together. Oh, the horror. Because now you don't have to wonder. They're dead. And killing off disabled characters removes the worry of what's going to happen to them later. And also, in death, they're made safe, and they're no longer suffering. And there's this really awesome trope, it's horrifically common, where when the disabled person dies, they're no longer disabled, or they meet their non-disabled half, and they become whole for the first time in their lives, and they can finally be at peace. Bonus points if in death their crutches fall away. That's bonus points for that. I see that way too many times. In the decades after the Second World War, cure or kill stories, which is like our version of bury your gays, you have two options. Cure them, or kill them off. They became significantly less common because everybody started to associate eugenics directly with the nefarious activities happening in World War II. I really don't want to get demonetized. I would argue that of late, cure or kill narratives are becoming a lot more popular again, and I would like that to stop. Please. As with any tired trope, if it's used or written by a disabled person and or used tastefully and thoughtfully, I don't actually take major issue with it. However, I don't think that this falls into that category, simply how the show has handled disability and disabled actors. Again, we're getting there. I'm not actually entirely against his disability changing in death, in the sense that if these versions of them are their inner consciousness, like, my inner consciousness forgets I'm disabled all the time. I will remember halfway through cooking a meal that I am allergic to the thing that I'm cooking and I can't eat it. I will plan entire vacations for an able-bodied version of myself that doesn't exist, and I rarely factor my physical disabilities into my daydreams. That being said, my inner consciousness does include the regular medical aids I regularly use, such as my back brace and my glasses or my contacts, because they're effectively a part of my body that I am never without, and I don't really know life without them. So, him going from non-speaking to speaking in his inner consciousness solidly could be a maybe. If it were played by a disabled person and generally explained in the script a little bit, I would actually be okay with that. However, in the off-Broadway version, Ricky literally goes, well, I guess I don't need these things here anymore, picks up his crutches, says goodbye to each one, and throws them, which feels like a hard no for me, because he should know what his daydreams look like and not be surprised that he suddenly doesn't need his mobility aids if that's what they're going for. And yes, we can try to say like disabled people don't want to be cured or they don't dream about themselves not disabled, but there are some disabled people who do feel that way, and we cannot just erase their experiences because we want to believe that everybody is proud of their disability. Frankly, as a disability advocate whose life revolves around disability, I sometimes hate being in a disabled body. I was crying about this yesterday. That's real life in a world that hates you. It happens. My further issue with this whole situation is that he's the only one whose disability gets cured in death. Like, Constance still needs her glasses after she dies, something just as much a medical aid as his crutches are, so Why does she still use those? I've also heard arguments saying that Ocean and Constance are very autistic coded and their autism isn't cured when they die, so that fits in this argument as well. As somebody who works with a lot of playwrights and whatnot, they all write autistic characters completely by accident. I don't think that was intentional disability representation. Just another example of this character needs to be over the top this trait to make it read on stage and then come across as wildly autistic by accident, like we saw with Elphaba, Evan Hansen, Dawn from Waitress, Horton from Seussical, Pippin, Cinderella. I made a video about that. You can watch that up here. So yes, that should be a part of the argument on some level, but I don't think that's gonna help us if we were having a discussion with the writers of the show. I also think in general, having a disabled character in a story about life and death, particularly one with a degenerative disease, is something that's genuinely quite interesting, and they could have played with that more and really built up Ricky's character in regards to that, because not to get existential here, maybe I'll make a video about this one day if I'm in the headspace, but life and death look very different to people who have had to look at death face to face throughout their life. It looks very different to people who have a life expectancy hanging over their heads. And I think that this would have been really cool to have a conversation about that and have one of the first really truly authentic disabled characters in a musical reflect that on some level. Like, I'm not opposed to Ricky giving up his spot in the running if his reasoning were very clearly, well, I've lived my whole life coping with the reality that my death is could be tomorrow, so at this point I'm just vibing and we're on to the next adventure. Because I think he would do something like that. I think that's in character for him, and I think that that's like authentically disabled. But my other further issue beyond the continuity errors of these disabilities are cured and these ones aren't is that many people argue extensively that Ricky is in fact not a disabled character and therefore does not need to be played by a disabled person because for most of the show he isn't technically disabled. Which I made this argument with Curious Incident so strongly, saying that like, oh, Chris is never stated as autistic, so he doesn't need to be played by a minority person. The obsessive need to over-explain why you don't need to cast a disabled person in an even disability adjacent role makes it very clear what kind of person you see as default, and that you are afraid to make the responsible choice and work with minority people because of whatever sort of internalized ableism situation you have going on. To me, the aggressive need to defend your casting choice for a role that people view as disabled by continuing to state that no, the character isn't actually disabled based on a tiny technicality shows that you're just uncomfortable working with disabled people. You can cast the role as a disabled person who's an ambulatory wheelchair user or just a wheelchair user. You can change the script to have the character still uses mobility aids after death because in his brain and life he probably does. These are easy fixes. Also, in general, a disabled person isn't going to apply for a job or audition or a role that they know that they're unable to do. If you are going to have a disabled character in your show, even if it's only technically disabled for the first number of the show, do the disability community a favor and hire one of us to act the role. We make up 20 to 25% of the population, and I can almost guarantee you that your disability rep in regards to actors and people behind the scenes isn't even close to making that quota. But don't worry, they fixed this problem by completely deleting Ricky's physical disability altogether in the 2023 version of the script, the one that was being performed at Arena until like three weeks ago. He no longer has a degenerative disease, he's instead non-speaking because of trauma. So they deleted the visible physical disability and made it an invisible mental disability, which is still cured in death. And it seems like they're claiming that it's to fix the issues with disability representation in the show, but the issue was the curing in death situation, which they didn't fix. Also, this is a nitpicky thing, but most people who cannot speak, either due to trauma or physical inability, use some sort of AAC, or alternative communication. I know that in the show they talk about how his family uses some weird sort of home signing situation to communicate with him. That was removed in the 2022 production, but whether he's using home sign or not, if he's going to school and passing his classes without his parents coming to translate for him, which seems like that's the case, that means he has some sort of communication, most likely through typing. Also, in order to create his own entire space-age world, he probably had to like watch movies or Google things. Like, he has the ability to type, I'm quite sure of that. So I'm not sure why it so frequently tries to give the vibe that he's completely just locked in and nobody listens to him, because sure, yes, that's often the case for non-speaking people on some level, but given how he communicates when he's speaking in his mind in death, where is his alternative communication? And we don't see much of these characters pre-accident, but it feels very odd to me that everybody is so surprised that he's capable of communication and that he has thoughts in his head in death. Like, something's missing there. Not to mention that narratively, the choice in making Ricky non-speaking, they also continuously call him mute, and I said mute earlier in this video and I shouldn't have done that, but mute gives a very particular historical sense, in the same way that calling somebody mentally ill versus calling them bad have two very different meanings, and one of them puts you into a time period. Mute also does that. We say non-speaking or non-verbal today. That is the thing that we do, and he is still called mute everywhere. and that's annoying. Anyway, narratively, the choice of making him non-speaking doesn't really make sense other than that one line where he's like, no one listened to me in life, which can still easily make perfect sense if he were a speaking person and or a speaking disabled person, because that is the disability experience, that is the queer experience, that is the trans experience, that is the minority experience. People don't listen to you, and that's just part of the fun of it. So the script decided to suddenly change his entire backstory, and this is a backstory that has been consistent for nearly 10 years, if not more. Same with all of the other characters. And they haven't even changed it in a clear or good way. There's a reference in the show that's still there to Ricky's Make-A-Wish style thing. They left that in there in the script changes, despite him no longer having a disability that would warrant him getting a Make-A-Wish. Everything that I've heard about the new script is a complaint about how haphazardly cut this major portion of Ricky's character feels, and how it's more offensive and is weird than it used to be. Now, why did we make the script changes, you may be thinking? Let's pause on this topic and take a little field trip over to my trans and theater video to remind ourselves of another show that you may have heard of called Jagged Little Pill that did something very similar with their minority representation. Jagged Little Pill is a musical that exists. It's based on Alanis Morissette's music. It's a rock musical, I think. I don't know if it's categorized as that. I categorize it as that. Anyway, opened on Broadway in December of 2019. In its out-of-town run before then, a character by the name of Joe was non-binary and had a whole story arc about their mom not understanding their gender identity, and it was a really, really big deal. And then when they moved it to Broadway, they changed Joe's pronouns to she, her instead, and had her storyline about how her mother didn't understand that she was gay. And Iris Manas, a non-binary actor who had covered the role during the out-of-town run and was widely expected to take over that role when it went to Broadway, did not, in fact, get promoted. And when everybody went, hi, you kind of promised the first representation of a trans person on Broadway played by a trans person, and then you took it away. And Jagged Little Pill publicity team basically went, this trans representation was never trans representation. That was based on how you interpreted it, and we're sorry that you interpreted it that way. Which is really gaslighty, really weird. And then Iris basically said that Z would not be returning to the show. There was an article basically calling out the team of Jagged for wanting trans rep, but then treating them terribly, and allegations of discrimination and whatnot. And Jagged followed up with that, basically being like, we messed up. We're gonna talk through some stuff. We're gonna try to change some stuff in the script, and we're only gonna hire trans actors for this character in the future. So yay, we think things are gonna get better. Huzzah. But then at the same time, we learned that a non-binary actor in the show was refused time off of work to go get emergency surgery and was put in infinitely more danger because of that. Meanwhile, a cis actor was easily replaced to go on maternity leave. Those things were happening at the exact same time. And then a bunch of people announced they were leaving the show because the harm it had caused for the trans community. And then the Tony Awards happened and they win Best Book. You know, the book that's actively being rewritten because it was causing serious harm to the trans community. I'm gonna link Amy Lovett's video about the situation in the description for you because the depth she goes into this is very, very important. But I do specifically want to say, I heard about the situation, this was going down before I'd even considered I could be non-binary. And I watched these videos way back then and I was like, this is sad, the industry sucks. So yeah, it sucks, but maybe we learn from this, better luck next time. Watching this stuff again for this video and seeing the clips from the original production about gender identity in comparison to the Broadway production, I cried because like, if I could have taken people in my life who love the theater oh so much, but then refuse to understand my gender or respect my pronouns to see the original version of Jagged, I think my life today would be completely different. Like, you forget how much representation you don't have of yourself until you actually come face to face with good representation and you just sink into it and you feel heartbreakingly safe within it in a way that nothing else can. And you realize how much you don't have that. So it's not just a why didn't we get our turn thing. It's hard to explain, it's hard to understand unless you felt this before, but it is so much more than that. So, looking back at the sudden script changes and seeing how Jagged handled their issues with minority actors, hopefully you can connect some dots and realize that probably something happened with a minority actor and they're trying to fix it by deleting the minority altogether. And this is where we bring in Yannick Robin, who was the first disabled person to play Ricky Potts in the May 2022 McCarter Theater production of Ride the Cyclone in Princeton, New Jersey. They actually put in the work to make him a real thought out and fleshed out character. They got them to change some lines and elements of the script, and he kept his mobility aids after death, and they used them in a really cool way in the choreography. Also, Ricky's personality feels kind of like punk rock the whole time rather than a really weird tone shift from like sweet innocent baby to like, oh, and also I like space stuff. Like, it actually is consistent. And Yannick put in my notes, because he had humanity before he died in this version. I second this. That is correct.
In the bottom half of last year, like near the fall, there was like the YouTube channel for the theater had the trailer for our version of the show up. And that had started to get picked up on by fans. Listen, I'm not on Instagram. I don't have Facebook. I'm not on the TikToks. Like, these are not, at that time, these are not things that I'm doing. I'm just doing what I have to do on Reddit and Tumblr, like pretty anonymous. I have a Twitter, but that's really with all that's going on. But I noticed on YouTube that the comments under the trailer were like congratulating the theater, like for having a disabled actor. So I started commenting and being like, you shouldn't thank them. They were actually really mean to me. And then that got screenshotted and put on Twitter. And then that went viral. And people were like, what are you talking about? That's insane. And then I started talking about it on Tumblr. The thing I'm talking about essentially is that when a member of the theater offered me whether or not I wanted to audition, just like as a friend, I didn't do this through my agents. I was under the impression that they pitched me for it because it was a disabled character and I'm a disabled actor. So I was like, oh, cool. If they're like doing this right, I guess. Let's talk about hindsight, okay? It is not enough to hire someone. If you've changed nothing about your structure, if you haven't been mindful in terms of the production and its makeup, including costume design, set design, rehearsal scheduling, all those things, if you don't have an understanding of what ADA compliance is, I don't think you should be working on shows with disabled characters and shows with disabled actors. And that by no means, let me be very clear, by no means does that mean we are not hireable people. It's just we require safety, and that's not a legal given for us right now, which is wild that we can just work in a place that is illegally unsafe for us to be in, and there's no one like doing anything about that. Yeah, so I was in there and I did the thing for some time, and I started advocating because, you know, we went into it with an open relationship with the director and the team, with a willingness to listen to any suggestions that we had on changing lines and explaining that. And then they would go back to the writers and like advocate for such things. And so we began to start talking about things that we wanted to change. I had some changes I wanted, because I felt that as a disabled character, there was ableism being thrown at him and that he was the butt of the joke because he was disabled, and that we should be doing something else other than that. And then they kind of hit me with, he's not disabled, what are you talking about? And so all of the phobias and isms ultimately amounted to 3 days before the last show. So there were like 3 show days left after this day. I had a moment where I wasn't feeling well, and the show had already started, and it's a 1 act, and there are only 6 people on stage, so you can't really leave. So I was sort of like working my way through the show as much as I could, and it got to a point where I couldn't be on stage anymore, and so I had to leave after Sugar Cloud, and I went to the loo and had a medical emergency, as one does, and the door was being knocked on the entire time. Just like, hi, you know you're supposed to be on stage right now, right? Like, why aren't you on stage? Like, what do you do? Are you coming out? Like, the show's about to end. Are you gonna make it for the end of the show? And I'm like, yeah, just give me a second. My mic's still off, right? Like dying, right? And then I come out very disoriented, not sure what to do. I can't hear the speakers anymore, so I don't know what the fuck is going on in the show. I'm not concerned about it. I'm just trying to not die. And I get out of the bathroom, and everybody in the team is there. All of the heads of the team of the show are circled in a horseshoe around the door to the bathroom. And immediately, yeah, and just start asking me like, why did you leave? Why did you do that? And I was like, if you remember me mentioning this, because it happened once in a rehearsal at the very beginning of this process, part of my disabilities is that I, on a random whim, usually from 1 to 5 a.m. every day, will throw up blood. Very uncommon for me to do it in the middle of the day. But if it does happen, it's very fast and I'm swift. And the second I'm out, if I don't tell you that it happened, you won't know, like after 5 minutes. The bounce back here is terrifying because I have to prove myself to people all the time, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I was like, Y'all, if we had 20 minutes left of the show, I would go out there right now and finish that thing. I don't know why this happened right now. I'm sorry I didn't make it to the end. I tried to leave in a place that left the least amount of dramaturgical questions for the audience. I don't know what else to say to you. And then they were like, just go back to the hotel, whatever. Next day, I get a text from the DEI person. Do you have time for a video call? I say, sure, what's up? She just sends the link. Cut to me having a conversation with her and the stage manager about how my body is too physically inconsistent for the requirements of theater, not just this theater, but regional theater and all of Broadway. And it was the mistake of the theater to believe that they were ready to be working with a person such as me and to bring me onto this project. And so that I didn't have to worry about playing the shows anymore for the rest of the 3 days, because they were going to the able-bodied understudy. And so they did. That is how the show closed without me. They went back and told the team that we left on mutual terms, which is not true, because it was not a conversation. It was not a discussion. There were not options. I was simply called on the phone to be told their version of events.
I'm just gonna completely refilm the rest of this video rather than continuously editing in legal words into what already existed, because I was not careful when I made this. To finish up that story, Yannick said that he asked during that call if there had been any conversations around terminating them due to conduct, work ethic, or anything else, and was told no, it was specific to that incident. Since then, the McCarter Cyclone team collaborated with the Arena Theater to do the show there in DC, with Yannick's non-disabled understudy in the role of Ricky Potts, and script changes that removed Ricky's physical disability, and Yannick created the hashtag Save Ricky Potts campaign and change.org petition. That production closed in DC about a week before I originally posted this video, and I don't really know much about where the show has gone and what it's been doing after that point. Again, if you want a more thorough history into the events and balanced narrative of both Yannick and McCarter's side, head to the Wait in the Wings documentary. I also want to note, outside of the situation, just so that you have an idea of what the landscape can look like for disabled theater practitioners, I have had theater professionals in the educational sphere tell me to my face in front of large groups of students, the theater isn't made for people like you, and call me a burden on the program for just being a part of it. So it's not like discriminatory language isn't an active problem within the industry. And I will also note, sometimes even if a DEI coordinator is directly involved, because DEI often leaves out disability, which is also a discussion for another day. But I want to branch off in the situation to talk about a few general things around ableism in the workplace just while we're here, just so that you know disability law, because I think that's cool. It is illegal to terminate somebody's employment on the basis of their disability or their accommodations, and that is very tricky and a sketchy line, because like if somebody's very consistently not showing up to work because of a disability, that is something they can be fired for, because if with accommodations given they're unable to do the job, they're unable to do the job. So in this particular case, had they theoretically terminated employment as a result of running off stage to be sick as a result of a disability, that would be illegal, given how a non-disabled person in that situation would get like the, oh my goodness, are you okay conversation, because it would be seen as sort of a one-off thing. And for a disabled person with a chronic illness, it's usually seen as something that you're able to control, and so therefore you should be able to control it. Like the amount of Broadway stars who have told stories about running off stage between songs to be sick, or having somebody swing on for them mid-show and not have that as an employment risk for them, is very, very many. Another example of this would be when I was a lot younger and used to get sick all the time. I was like sick on and off for an entire semester, and I lost points every time I missed a class, and was continuously brought in for meetings to discuss what was to be done about my absences and my grades, and I was given loads of extra assignments to make up for it. Meanwhile, 2 other non-disabled students missed about the same number of classes that I did because they were sick with other things, often around the same time and length that I was, and they were told to rest and given a free pass. And that would be a clear discrimination situation. And again, I'm not saying that that's what happened here, because I don't think that's what happened here. I'm just giving this information should you wonder about it. Also, for the briefest ADA overview, under the ADA, you are not required to disclose your disability to your employers, and they're required to make reasonable accommodations to enable you to do the essential functions of your job. And for invisible disabilities requiring accommodations, employers have the right to require documentation from a medical or healthcare provider. All they need is one letter stating your disability and how it may limit you, and they are not allowed to tell other people what your disability is or discuss your accommodations with other workers. They can only identify what those accommodations are and how they can be implemented. Generally, disabled people are expected to apply for jobs that they are capable of doing. We know ourselves and our capabilities better than absolutely anybody else does, and we do need to be trusted on that, which is why discrimination in the hiring process is a bad idea. But obviously there's many loopholes here, especially when it comes to hiring people for jobs, because if somebody just doesn't fit the energy here, that is a legal and valid reason to not hire somebody, even if the reason that they may not fit that energy is because they're autistic. Just because the law or rules say one thing in a way meant to prevent discrimination does not mean that they actually always do that. And also, since you're not required to disclose your disability disability in a job interview, and you really shouldn't unless it's super relevant to the situation at hand. I often will disclose in interviews because I do disability work, but generally you shouldn't. Often unconscious bias will creep in because people may not realize there is disability present or a disability disconnect, which becomes a slippery slope that I'm not going to get into today because you're not here to learn about employment law. That's not why you're watching this video. But one last thing on that topic that you should know, since the first ADA case against employers, which was filed in 1992, employers have won 92% of all court decisions. And it's very easy to turn any discrimination situation where discrimination usually happens verbally and isn't written down or recorded, or it's indirect, or it's implicit bias and microaggressions. And so these situations get very messy very quickly, particularly since, again, work on DEI issues in workplaces usually does not include disability. So there's more of an energy of like, oh, we'll deal with that when the people get here, without realizing that disabled people are usually already in your workplace, and also the fact that they're not really there right now is half the problem. Like, if you build a community space down a flight of stairs and you go, oh, we'll deal with accessibility when a wheelchair user wants to come, you're never going to know when that day actually happens because they're already steering clear of the community space because it's inaccessible to them, and it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But anyway, back to Cyclone itself and the fact that Ricky no longer has his physical disabilities. At the end of the day, creators don't owe us anything. They don't owe us good representation, whatever that may be. They don't owe us representation at all. They are welcome to cut and move things around in their scripts all they want. They've been doing that. This show has been growing and changing over time, as all shows do, and scripts are going to change and things are going to get cut. It just happens. The thing here is not the fact that they're changing stuff, but the context behind it, which doesn't look great, and I'm gonna be super real with you on that. I'm not saying that either the old or the new Rickies are bad representation, nor do I believe that bad representation or good representation actually exist. There's only harmful and non-harmful representation, and sometimes authentic representation can still find its way into the harmful category. Ricky, to some degree, is messy representation, which is actually, at least to me, the ideal kind of representation, because if we have characters who are multifaceted and messy, they're human, and at the end of the day, that is what we want when it comes to creating minority characters. You will always find your way into one stereotype or another because most stereotypes exist in the binary. So what matters more is being conscious about what stereotypes you fall into and how you want to go about that and flesh out a character to be more multidimensional. However, I don't think Ricky himself is multidimensional enough to put him into the non-harmful category as he currently stands. Something I didn't clock when I originally made this video that I want to tie in here is the complicated legacy of how we write disability in theater. I've made about 20 dramaturgy deep dives at this point. I think maybe only 14 or 15 are on this channel. I work on these months in advance, so I have several cooking. I also freelance dramaturg for things, and that doesn't always end up in this series, or it will one day. That's beside the point. What I mean to say is that in my time of analyzing all of these different shows with disability in them, there are certain archetypes that we see repeated in new disabled characters written after previous shows, particularly if the original show is super successful. A great example of this would be Laura Wingfield from The Glass Menagerie. Just about every single disabled woman or girl character in theater since then has more or less been a variation of Laura Wingfield. Almost every single disabled former Laura that I talked to for that video mentioned to me that they feel like they play Laura constantly in every single audition that they've gotten since then. And the reason that I bring this up is because when I initially made this video, I didn't know a lot about the specific touchstone characters in disabled theater history beyond like Richard III to look at the show and go, oh, Ricky's just off-brand Tommy from The Who's Tommy. And that explains way more than you think it's going to. To be as brief as possible, I will link the full video above because this is one of my favorite projects to date and you should go check it out. Tommy is a rock musical written by The Who that tells the story of a boy who sees his father kill his mother's lover in self-defense and becomes functionally catatonic, becoming known as the deaf, dumb, and blind boy. And we see him growing up and all the trauma that he endures and how that makes him curl further and further into himself and into his inner world. But then he becomes incredible at pinball, and then the mirror he likes to stand in front of all the time gets smashed, and that like wakes him up and he becomes a sort of pinball messiah. There's zero way to explain that doesn't sound like an acid trip, but that's just what it is. But the idea of a mute boy who seemingly has nothing going on from the outside, but then we find out via rock music that he has this super rich inner world, and the idea of him being a sort of messiah in this dream and followed by tons of groupies and being a sort of sex god is also very Tommy-esque as well. Not to mention that Space Age Bachelor Man begins very similarly to like a mix between The Amazing Journey and Pinball Wizard. And the whole thing is just serious Who inspiration. And I don't think that that was an accident. Or if it wasn't directly out loud spoken inspired in that way, it implicitly almost definitely was, because Tommy completely changed the musical theater scene. Also, the use of mute rather than the updated non-speaking is also indicative of its roots in something else outside of the medical sphere. So if the desire were to have a non-speaking super charismatic sex god character who has a lot more going on inside than you think when you initially meet him, and you want him to sing a rock song, you can see how this happened. And I think the fact that the new changes to this character take away the physical disability stuff that clearly didn't go well in the McCarter production and instead make him significantly closer to just being an alternate universe version of Tommy makes the inspiration even clearer to me. And I can't help but wonder if there was a piece of, well, everybody's cool with Tommy as he is, so maybe Backlash in regards to representation will get better if we just make him explicitly Tommy and put him into that archetype even stronger. When unfortunately, part of why Tommy didn't get that much backlash in the past is because it's a much older intellectual property and most people see it as inherently dated, and also the Tommy revival that advertised itself as re-envisioning Tommy for a new generation made it clear that a lot of people actually aren't super cool with how Tommy exists as a character, and it is an issue, which I'm sure will further make the Ricky character changes look not so great going forward, unfortunately. And that leads to a really interesting conversation around archetype and time period and what we're willing to accept when. We're not going to get into that rabbit hole right now. I will also say that like these changes being made amidst backlash and being arguably the wrong way to address said backlash obviously makes that more complicated. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in the video, about like how there's kind of two different narratives going on, and I think the fact that the issue was talking about accessibility in theater and the solution was to change the script is not the solution, because that's not actually what the problem was. There are discussions to be had about probably we should be changing the script, we should be working with the script, and things should be happening with that, but that's not actually where the primary issue is. Now in regards to what do we do next with this whole situation is really one of the first times that I feel like ableism in the industry really hit the mainstream to this degree, and so a lot of the backlash around it was more focused on this theater and these creatives are bad, rather than opening up a wider conversation around issues of disability in theater, which is what I wish could have happened. I feel like the Jagged Little Pill situation ended similarly in regards to trans people. And while we can and should critique specific things like that, there is this sort of marketing tactic to treat it like an outlier situation, like the exception to the rule rather than the rule, which isn't super fair to the various individual activists and activist organizations on the ground who are carefully working to bring these issues up to producers and directors and make changes happen on a more long-term institutional level. I went at this original video with a level of frustration at the system because my entire life at the time was centered around ableist discrimination in a theatrical setting, and since I'd experienced that a few times before, I assumed that was standard and no changes were really being made. But I found that in the last year and a half or so of being here that like, yeah, there's serious institutional problems, don't get me wrong. There are corners being cut to save money or to avoid uncomfortable conversations, but just as much as that's happening, I'm also finding directors and actors and producers and writers who really want to learn about these issues and how to change things. Just super anecdotally, I often feel like I make these analyses into the void, but then I will meet somebody at a stage door or walk into an audition room and they will know of my work. They will tell me how they shared it to their friends and how they're excited for changes around disability conversations that are happening and offer to help me with my research. And I'm not saying this to like brag that I have reach or whatever. I'm saying it to point out that like, while we may not hear people talking about it publicly very often for various reasons, those conversations are absolutely being had. I will also say that like, I will do consulting work on people's scripts or their books or whatever for commission. I don't do it for free. I don't have time to do it for free. But I get people emailing me with stuff all the time from the industry who want help and want to work on these kinds of projects and want consultancy. So the idea of disability consultancy, disability dramaturgy, and wanting to get these things right as created by non-disabled people is getting exponentially stronger and more of a conversation, even if it's mostly happening behind closed doors. Huge institutional changes are slow, sure, and they're going to continue to be. Our theater education system is based on what disabled physicality can you try on to learn something about your inner self. Nearly every show insists on using way more flashing lights than is necessary, and most theaters on Broadway only have one accessible restroom. Also, there's at least one that just doesn't have one at all. And functionally, every new disabled character in theater is either an iteration of Richard III, Christopher Boone, Laura Wingfield, or Tommy Walker. And well, it's not technically a disability, so we don't have to cast authentically or talk about the ethics of it. Conversations continue to happen, and ableist casting choices continue to be made. But at the same time, the individual conversations around these issues have been moving and changing very, very quickly, and that brings me a lot of hope. Because as time goes on, that can and will become institutional change. That can and will become the norm. I've already seen it become change on the micro level. Do I think the Ride the Cyclone script could use a little bit of work? Yes, for sure. Disability and controversy aside, I really don't think they fleshed out each character equally, and the choice doesn't seem super narratively deliberate. And I think Ricky in particular has a lot of currently untapped potential that would really make this show shimmer in a really cool way. But I also understand why the writing team, after all of this, would feel hesitant to work with a disability dramaturg in any capacity to try to make it any different. To me, his character returning to the Tommy archetype roots makes that fairly clear. But again, conversations on this stuff have changed significantly since I made that video 2 years ago, and disability dramaturgs like me are becoming slightly more normalized. So genuinely, who knows? In regards to changes to the character, my personal choice would be to put the physical disability back into the character and then reflect on the fact that Ricky's going to look at death differently as somebody with a degenerative disease and use that angle. I think there are aspects of disabled joy and disabled grief in this show already that can be expanded upon a great deal to create a truly interesting and unique character beyond Tommy with crutches. He's usually inhabited by actors as more than just Tommy with crutches, so I do know that that's possible. And should they choose to keep in the verbality aspect of this character, I would love for them to use some form of AAC. I think there could be a world where he has intermittent or unreliable speech and uses both AAC and speech interchangeably if there's like concern about the song situation making narrative sense. All discussions that could be had. Who knows? I know there was commentary at one point around the idea of fixing the problem by making Ricky deaf and having him be simulcast like you see in many Deaf West shows, which would mean that there is a person signing and a person who is their voice. I don't think this idea would be particularly effective in that there's only 6 people on the stage, so adding a 7th would be quite strange. There's also an issue around this being the most culturally, I hate to use the word palatable, but I think that's what I'm going to go for, like palatable version of authentic disability in theater because it's the one most people have awareness of at this point, primarily because of Deaf West Spring Awakening, and also because many deaf folks don't consider themselves disabled, so that's a separate can of worms. That's been changing over the last couple years, but still. So not only would this be very logistically weird to do that to Ricky, but it would also feel like taking out a disability presentation people feel more uncomfortable around, and they're replacing it with something else that people feel more comfortable around, which sort of defeats the purpose to begin with. And also disabilities are not interchangeable, obviously, not to mention that the point here is the physical disability erasure, so replacing it with another invisible disability that becomes visible by use of signs sort of ignores the argument that we came in with. I personally think that this would be a great chance to be one of the first representations of non-sign language AAC in a show and including mobility aid users to expand representation in the industry. I don't think that that's too much to ask for. But what I think is successful about this show is that it's about community and individuality and how beyond what you may see from an outside glance, all lives are important and meaningful and worthy of celebration, and viewing mortality through the lens of young people in a way that connects to all kinds of people. Really, the only times that my generation saw this idea was through like those middle grade books with an autistic main character narrating grief in a stereotypical autism voice to try to make it kid friendly. I'm thinking like Counting by Sevens, Extremely Loud, Incredibly Close, that's what it's called. Rain Rain is another example of that. Or it was just like a fantasy book or a historical book. We don't get modern day kids living regular lives confronting reality and mortality very often. And I think that's why this connected with people so much and continues to connect with people for being different and weird and touching on the hard stuff. And it's been really successful with that in certain directions. And it has some growing to do in other directions. And when looking at what I'm going to call the Ride the Cyclone situation, just to simplify it, it's very important to acknowledge that there are 2 entirely separate conversations here that are being conflated as the same thing. The first being the issue of how we write quality representation in theater, and the second being issues of inaccessibility, particularly physical inaccessibility in theater. And while those 2 conversations can coincide and overlap and they affect a lot of the same people, we really shouldn't act like they're the same discussion, which I think led a lot of the frustration around the industry itself to fall onto this one show in a way that's not super fair to anybody involved, really. Like, let's bring this energy to critiquing other shows that also involve disability and learning about media critique. Let's bring this energy to supporting disabled stories and disabled performers in all kinds of shows. Go see Suffs, go see Our Town. Let's bring this energy to creating conversations around issues with inaccessibility in the arts, like the fact that ADA compliance is often a thing people think about after they've decided to cast a disabled actor, even though casting is the very last part of world building for a show, since most of the design is already planned by then, or the fact that we use way too many strobe lights in shows right now, or other things I can't think about at the moment because my brain feels like it's filled with cobwebs. But I talk about issues with disability in theater all the time on this channel, so I'm sure there's other things to be mad about and spend energy on trying to change that exist in other videos somewhere. Honestly, just spending the time to learn about these things and to pay attention to these things and then point them out to other people goes a really, really, really long way. But anyway, I'm going to leave this one here. I still think this situation is a great opportunity for the wider musical community to actually think about and confront issues of disability in theater. The most popular show for young people with a disabled character before this was Crutchy and Newsies, who's objectively fantastic representation. So I think there was a sort of assumption that the issues of ableism in theater were fixed beyond, hey, maybe we should authentically cast things now. And I do think that this changed the conversation significantly and left space for disabled people to tell their stories of inaccessibility, and also left more conversations saying, oh, actually, we haven't fixed the problem. We still write bad representation on stage today. If you like what you learned here, I have much, much deeper dives into disability and other shows, which I've linked at the top of the description for you. I've also linked the video series on accessible theater and arts education I made for my undergrad thesis below as well. You're welcome to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to hang around. I also have a Patreon if you want early access to what I'm up to. But do whatever sparks joy for you. Absolutely no pressure. Though go check out the Wait in the Wings documentary if you haven't yet. You gotta go do that. And yeah, as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.